Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Police and Crime panel, the Leicestershire Rutland Police and Crime panel. We'll start with minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of December 2023. Everyone happy with the accuracy of the minutes?
Sorry, Chair. I don't want to sound like a broken record on this, but I think we were told that we would be given details of Operation Tacit, figures of prosecutions.
These are just for accuracy, not matters arising, so it's just accuracy of the minutes.
Sorry, Chair.
Anything on the accuracy of the minutes from anybody? No. Okay. On to item 2, public question time. We have received one question from the member of the public that has been circulated to all members of the panel. The question has been answered and given back to the resident, and they're happy with the answer, and it's all on the website if anyone wants to have a look at it. Item 3, there's no urgent items. Any declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda from anybody? No? Okay, on to item 5. So the police precept proposal and the 2024, I think I'm presuming that should say 2025 budget on there, not 24 and 24. Pages 11 to 78. So if I hand over to you, Mr. Matthews first.
Thank you, Chair and members of the panel. I'm here today to ask you to approve my proposal to raise the police precept for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland by the amount of £13 per year per household for Band D properties for the year 2024 to 25. To cover the details of this proposal and the reasons behind it, I'll be shortly handing over to the Chief Constable, who will provide an overview of his policing requirements, followed by the Chief Executive Officer of the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, who will cover the activities of the OPCC, and finally to the Chief Finance Officer of the OPCC, who will give you more detailed financial information about the proposal. But before that, I would just like to say a few words by way of introduction. As you all know, the budget that I've put together covers both the Leicestershire Police and the activities of the OPCC, such as victim support, crime prevention, and the commissioning of various services. I'm putting forward a request that you approve a rising precept of £13 to ensure we continue to deliver the level of service that the public expect. I feel I should say that the Chief Constable, Chief Executive, and I have all sat down, gone over the figures with great care, and have arrived at the conclusion that this is the correct figure to recommend to you. We have sought to estimate the impact of future variables, challenge the way in which services are provided, and look to see that we are all working in an efficient and effective manner. Inflation may now be on a very welcome downward trajectory, but we're all keenly aware of the economic and financial pressures on people and businesses. People will already be feeling the pinch as the price of fuel, food, clothing and other household goods continues to increase. I'm sure that everybody around this table has, at some time, felt the pinch of financial hardship. It is therefore our duty to ensure that we take as little from the public in taxation as it is possible to do and still deliver the services that the public require and request. It is worth mentioning at this point that the national funding formula for policing does not work in our favour. Important variables, such as the presence of prisons or the protests at Meridian, are not taken into account. If these and other factors were taken into account, we would be rather better off. I've already lobbied the Home Secretary on this and will continue to do so. I've requested a face-to-face meeting with the Home Secretary and have been given an assurance that one will take place before the date of the spring budget on the 6th of March. Those of you who have been here from the start of my term in office will be aware that I favour a cautious and sustainable approach to finances. So this is a budget for sustainable policing and other services to carry our city and 2 counties into a sustainable and viable future, built on the Pelian principles and aimed at giving the people the protection they deserve and expect. Of course, we have a general election due before the end of this year. We must wait and see what the manifestos of the various parties say about policing and public order, and then wait to see if those promises are kept by whichever party or parties form the next government. So much of what will take place in the future is sadly hidden from us. But if it is difficult to see through a glass darkly, we can at least be certain what this precept rise and this budget are going to achieve in the coming financial year. This budget will consolidate the uplift in police officers, enable the continuation on the delivery of all elements of the police and crime plan, support the work to drive up public confidence, including the delivery of the new Leicestershire Police Pledge, protect the investment in key service areas of importance to local communities, maintain the force's focus on rural crime with the rural crime team, sustain the new community cohesion team, enable better and stronger local neighbourhood policing, augment the work with the business community, embed the new prevention directorate, develop and optimise new diversionary programmes to prevent crime, provide tailored and targeted support and intervention to both victims and offenders who display additional risk of becoming a victim or of further offending. Secure the investments made to strengthen supervision, leadership and visibility in local policing. Uphold the strongest senior leadership in the city and in the 2 counties that have already been welcomed by communities, and support the delivery of the next phase of transformation linked with IT and digital restructuring. We're here to discuss financial figures, but it is entirely proper that I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the many men and women who work tirelessly, often for long and antisocial hours, to keep us all safe from harm. It is, of course, always unfair to pick out a few for praise, but our police officers and police community support officers go out on the front line. Our core handlers take details and offer advice to concerned citizens who are often in difficult and emotionally challenging situations. Our victim support workers deal with people when they are at their most vulnerable. Crime prevention and diversionary staff help to steer those who are at risk of falling into criminal lifestyles back into more productive activities. And police staff shoulder much of the burden of investigations and other work quietly but effectively behind the scenes. And nobody could do their jobs if it were not for the accountants, HR staff, cleaners, car mechanics, and so many others who sit and work uncomplainingly to keep the show on the road. In conclusion, I would like to pay tribute to all those who have worked so hard to put the budget together. Of course, the Chief Constable, the Deputy Chief Constable and their teams, but also the Chief Executive and Chief Financial Officer of the OPCC and the staff who operate under them. Chair, I commend to you this budget and request that this panel approves the £13 precept rise. Thank you. I would like to hand over to the Chief Constable if that is all right.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Police and Crime Commissioner, and again, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to join you at the panel, and I know that many of you have lived the journey of transformation over the years, so no doubt there'll be a bit of reference back to that. Firstly, I'm going to make a sweeping assumption that you have all read the very comprehensive and detailed reports that you've had, so I don't intend to go through in any particular detailed order of paragraph by paragraph, but what I would say is those of you that have known me for many years will know that we will approach this with always trying to do the right thing for the communities of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, and also trying to support the very good men and women that work within the police service, and it's going to be a tricky period. I think you will recognise that. You will also recognise that in the statement that's been attached to the reports, that it is a slightly longer and probably more pointed statement that you're used to receiving. And let me start by just very quickly explaining why that is. So firstly, I want to say thank you to the Police and Crime Commissioner for the support of seeking the approval of the maximum of £13. But I want to also put on record that I am deeply disappointed by the budget. I'm disappointed by the budget because it falls short of what is required to sustain the current level of policing requirements across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. And I'm frustrated that, as the panel members will have recognised, that this is not a situation that is of our making. And it's primarily underpinned by a number of factors. And the first one, as you will have picked out in the detailed reports, the budget deficit that we face in year is primarily driven by the unfunded pay awards of 22-23 and 23-24. And again, I'd like to just formally put on record, Chair, last year you kindly wrote to the Policing Minister, and I know that we did get a response, but of course that was a very high level response, and the devil is always in the detail with these things. So this is not a new phenomenon, and it's not one that we present to you that we've not shared before, but effectively the drivers behind this budget deficit are primarily around an unfunded pay award. We also are the subject of a funding formula, which, and I say this with absolute heart, I feel the people of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland are not being given a fair slice of the formula. Now, that was recognised some 8 years ago. And again, I want to put on record, I'm very grateful to the Police Inquiry Commissioner who has picked this matter up. And I am meeting with the Policing Minister again on Monday, and I will be raising it. Because effectively what the funding formula is doing is the payroll data gets sucked into the centre. That payroll then is looked at a national level, and then the funds are allocated and then distributed on a funding formula. 18 of the 43 forces receive a shortfall against their payroll. Now, if you think of the compounding element of that over multiple years, that leads to a fairly substantial deficit. So my suggestion to you would be, if you can help in any way, there is definitely something about creating momentum to resolve that funding formula challenge. So firstly, unfunded pay award. Secondly, an unfair, outdated funding formula that needs to be gripped hold of. And of course, as we go into this one, it's unlike previous periods where we're going into austerity. This is a period where we already start from a very low baseline, and we already have taken out 5 million last year, of which 3 million was sustainable to run through the period of the MTFP. So the first bit I would say is just an acknowledgement of the £13, a plea from me. This is not as in previous years where we've talked about a preset rise in the context of what growth can communities expect. Neither are we actually in the period of what can the precepts do in terms of sustainability. The harsh reality of this, and I say it, knowing that this is going to be a difficult period, this is about asking for the maximum precept to minimise the impact that this will have in terms of the budget and the budget shortfall. But as the Police Inquiry Commissioner rightly pointed out, we have had lots and lots of conversations about this, and I am confident actually that we will continue to deliver the elements of the Police and Crime Plan. We will continue to focus on the service and the commitments that we've made around the pledge and around the new structure and the leadership, the connected leadership. So I'm confident we can do that, but I don't want to mislead the panel in any way, shape or form. This is going to be a fairly difficult position going forward. The other bits that I'd probably draw your attention to is obviously I've highlighted the fact that this is not the first year of cuts. This feels like it's cuts round 2. So we did take out efficiencies last year. We recognise that we've got a 5.4 gap in year, but of course that's already on top of a 6% vacancy rate. So a 6% vacancy rate applied across the force, then with a 5.4 million gap on top of that. In reality, because of some of the restrictions that have been imposed by the budget, and look, I'll be the first to say I don't think we've got enough officers, so protecting the officer numbers is absolutely a good thing. The downside is if you are having to shrink an organisation, I think it's actually unhealthy to have one area protected and other with all the cuts falling on staff. Because in a modern police service, and I know it won't be lost on colleagues around this table, to deliver good modern policing, it needs a really good balanced mix of team and skills, and that's not all about officer numbers. It's often about the capabilities and the skills that the force require. But we are where we are, and the recommendation is that we maintain the officer numbers. So the budget gap will fall primarily on non-pay costs and revenue linked with staff. So I just sort of share that with you, and to put that into context, on staff numbers alone, potentially we could be talking up to 188 staff, which is a fairly significant number. What I would also share with the panel, and again, I feel like I'm talking to people that already know this, when we talk about staff, this is not people that are in back office just doing clerical. These are staff that are doing frontline roles. So when we talk about taking a £5.4 million gap in year, and that is falling on staff, we are going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions and it will have an impact in various different elements of the force. What I would say to you is there will be no area across the force that will be touched on by this level of cuts, but I'm confident that we will do it in a really sensitive and measured way. And I would probably pause there because obviously I could go on and describe some of the headlines around the operational paper if that would help, and then come back. But Chair, I'll be guided by you. We can either talk about what I've said so far, I can continue to talk about some of the operational threats, and then we can come back, whichever you like.
If we just pause there, because obviously we're taking it as read, so there may be questions that come to you rather than you reading it piece by piece. So if we just have a pause there and just take a few questions before we move on, and I think I just ought to explain to panel as well that the PCC is obviously proposing the precept of £13 per annum for a Band D property. So just so you're aware that the panel does have the power to veto the proposed precept, but this would require the support of 2/3 of the total membership of the panel, which would be 10 of our 15 members, and we've got 13 here today. So we are within that ability to veto the proposed precept if you want. So just so you're aware of that. So the PCC would then, if we do veto it, be required to notify the panel of his revised precept proposal by the 15th of February. And where the panel's report indicates that they vetoed the precept either because it was too high or because it was too low. So the panel would then need to reconsider the revised precept by the 22nd of February, just so everyone is aware of what our role is today. I'm very happy again to write to the Policing Minister and the Home Secretary to raise the point. I think, at Leicester County Council, we're also a victim of a bad funding formula that makes us the lowest funded county council. So I feel your pain about what to do, but the unfunded pay awards have also hit all local authorities as well as the police, and it's really, really difficult. And to sit there and talk about a reduction of staff of 188 is just horrendous across LLR for all the reasons that you've mentioned, because it's not just those bobbies on the beat, is it? It's all those people that are looking at online, hate and stuff like that. So that's really, really important. So I'm very happy on behalf of the panel to write that again. And one of my questions later on is for what the PCC is doing, but I'll probably ask that a little bit later. So I suppose my question for you is, if that is a huge staff reduction, when you announce that publicly, that does set the hairs running for staff and stuff like that. So I suppose it's how you're going to manage that going forward, and that the PCC, how is going to manage that going forward to ensure that staff don't run now, kind of thing, and that we have a force that is still able to operate even with a reduction in numbers.
Yeah. I mean, Joe, if I may, firstly, let me just start by saying, on the back of today's meeting, there is something ready to go to all senior leaders across the organisation. There's an extraordinary meeting that's been pulled together. This won't come as a surprise to them, but of course, those that are directly affected, the staff, we have some brilliant, really hardworking, really skillful staff. And you rightly point out, I don't want to lose them. So that we're going to put on a number of sessions where they can come and we can have a really open conversation with them. And we will work through in a really structured way, but we'll do it in a really transparent way. Do I think there will be those that will look at it and think, well, actually, I don't want to preempt the outcome, and therefore I'm going to start looking for a job? That is the harsh reality of it. I'm going to try desperately to discourage that, but I think we're all experienced enough to know that when people realise that the budget's going to reduce, and they're going to reduce in a particular area, and you're in that area, it's like anything, people will start to explore other avenues. Please be reassured, we're going to do lots and lots of really engaging communication with them. I'm almost effectively treating this as a critical incident because of the impact that it could have. And to minimise that impact, because what I don't want is it translating into a decline in performance and a decline in service, because I go back to the point at the beginning. The one thing I can say is not just I speak for myself, I speak for the team that I am part of. There is a huge commitment to do the best for the communities of Leicestershire and Rutland, and I want to maintain that. So it's difficult, it is going to be challenging. I need our staff to feel valued. So any touch points that you have with them, please reaffirm that. But the only way we can do it is to get on with it at pace and be open and transparent in how we go about it.
Les.
Thank you, Chair. So I would certainly fully endorse the letter. I think it is necessary, and I think it should be in the strongest possible terms. But Chief, just a question, because I think you said 18 out of 43 horses were challenged. So the opposite of that, of course, is then the 38, I think, or whatever it is.
25.
25, that one. Are they, I mean, we all know there's an archaic funding formula all the way through local government, national government, local. There just is. It's an archaic formula that does need reforming. Are they then by default adequately funded or well funded? So is it a matter of there's enough money in the system, it's just not quite distributed well enough, or is there a fundamental funding issue for the entirety of the force?
I would say I can't speak for all of the forces, but obviously I have got a bit of an inside track in terms of through MPCC, and I am not quiet in speaking to the Finance Committee, as you can imagine. My sense is that there will be those that, so if you think of the payroll, we fall short. So you will see in the report, 77% of the payroll was covered with the last pay award. So that gives you a sense of where the shortfall is. There will be other forces that are likely to be receiving their payroll and some. Now, of course, some of those forces that are receiving their payroll and some would probably argue that they're underfunded at the start anyway, and therefore, so we could get into all sorts of arguments about the funding. My sense is that the funding formula is in urgent need of reform, and it needs to recognise the complexities of what's going on in the locality. So if you look at Leicestershire, the demographic shift in Leicestershire has been significant, at 10% growth. You just look at the complexity linked with the different communities and the tension and the international to the local. None of that is factored in. The fact that we've got a continuous growth of prisons and other demands that are being placed on Leicestershire, none of that is captured within the funding formula. And that is what is the sense of frustration, because all of these additional complexities brings with it time and expectation and cost, none of which is funded. And I can think of forces of a similar size nearby without that level of complexity who might be receiving sufficient funding to cover their payroll.
Very diplomatic, if I may say so, Chair.
It's exactly the same, isn't it? As soon as you start saying we're underfunded, someone else will say, well, yeah, because that's the reason why, and we're not overfunded, but you get more than us, and it just starts a whole argument starting, so you never get anywhere. Sarah.
Thanks, Chair. I'm conscious that the panel wrote last year to the Minister. I'm conscious that Rob's raising things on a regular basis. PCC, you said about you'd asked for a meeting, preferably before the budget. Can I ask how many times and in what format you've raised this over your term of office? Because this isn't a recent phenomenon. As Rob said, this goes back at least 8 years in terms of significant issues of underfunding in the force. And I'd just like to understand your individual actions in trying to lobby to change this position for Leicester and Leicestershire. Rutland.
Over the course of my term in office, to be honest, I can't remember. It's 3 years. We've been working on it, I think, probably since the first time we had a budgetary discussion, which would have been 3 or 4 months after I first took office, I think, was when this first came up. So certainly I've been raising it with the different policing ministers that we've had since then. I had a meeting with Kit Malthouse that autumn, the first autumn I was in office. I had a meeting with Thomas Purseglove when he was in post, albeit he wasn't there very long. And I've had a meeting with Chris Philp. I have written to the the various Home Secretaries. I'm going to guess 3 or 4 times over that period of time. I can't be precise. But certainly we've got a letter which is ready to go as soon as this budget hopefully has been passed today, but if not, I'll come back with a revised one in a couple of weeks' time. So we've got a letter ready to go on in the wake of this, which includes all the correct figures, up to date and so on. And as I say, I've not only asked for a meeting with the Home Secretary before the budget, I've been promised that one will take place, albeit I don't yet have the date and venue. But that is a promise from his own office. So this isn't, you know, some minion somewhere. This has come direct from his office. So I'm willing to trust that will happen.
And has anything changed as a result of any of those meetings?
The funding formula hasn't changed, and the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners has also been lobbying on this. I assume that the National Police Chiefs Council has as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So of the 18 forces, you can imagine there's a lot of noise in that area, and NPCC and through the Finance Committee have raised it. My understanding is a recent announcement that the funding review would commence immediately after the election. So I will leave you to ponder on that.
Yeah.
We're still here next year. We'll see what happens. Okay. Any further questions for the Salma?
Thank you, Chair. Please excuse my naivety as an independent member when I ask this question. In light of the application for funding, when there were the tensions a couple of years ago in the Belgrave and in Highfields area, was that factored into your bid for funding? And when there are sort of unanticipated events like that, where does the funding come from, particularly when you recruit from outside the area for extra police officers? And is there reserve just in case something like that happens again?
Yeah, certainly in terms of applying for funding, I mean, obviously we get the guidance as to what we can go up to. So this is about the discussions around the £13 precept. To give you some assurance, certainly in terms of the East Leicester disorder, we did apply for a special grant. The cost of the East Leicester in its totality for that extended period was just in excess of over £1 million, nearly 1.2 million was the total cost of it. We got about 85% of that reimbursed through the Home Office. So we applied for a special grant and we got that grant back. Of course, there's an element of shortfall in that, but that we would pick that up through our contingency. And it's a really interesting point, because when you start to look at the budget, you'll see within there that we have a contingency, a general reserve. We have a budget equalisation, which we use primarily for invest to save and transformation, and we will be drawing down on that in the technical space. But we also factor in two things. One is an operational contingency, which generally we would draw down for to make the shortfall up for East Leicester, for example. And of course, a lot of that is policed by additionality linked to overtime. And I know there's likely to be a conversation around overtime and budgetary of overtime. And I can gladly expand on that, because of course a lot of these incidents are spontaneous, so they start off spontaneous, which will require us to put additional resource to it. The way that you galvanise operational hours quickly is through keeping people on duty or putting them on extended hours. That is generally a use of spontaneous overtime. But as you start to recognise that it's going to be an elongated incident, like the East Leicester, for example, and we might want to go from an 8-hour to a 12-hour shift, that then becomes planned. So the overtime pot, I may as well cover it off, the overtime pot, you'll have about 25% of that totality is just to cover bank holidays that we have to staff through an overtime budget. The rest is spontaneous and planned, and obviously that is how we draw it down and make sure that we've got the resource in the right place. But you need to think about overtime in the context of flexible operational hours, rather than just keeping people and offering people overtime. It's the flexibility that's required to have people in the right place at the right time.
Do you have a question, Madam?
Thank you, Chair. I think there's. I think we need to kind of separate two linked things here. One is being underfunded, and one is being unfairly funded. So I think that it's great that nationally police and crime commissioners are lobbying, but I think there is a question to ask about if Leicester and Leicestershire is being unfairly funded against other areas. Then there needs to be a special case made. And I think I'd be interested to have more detail on what special case is being made, politician to politician, police and crime commissioner to Home Secretary. And I think it would be interesting to understand what progress has been made within those conversations. I'm also interested in the significance of the keeping the 2.7% for your office, and what consideration has been made around changing that. I think freezing it at 2.7%. I guess there's a conversation to be had around that. If we're talking about an underfunded, unfairly funded police force, how is the OPC supporting that? Is there a need to review? And finally, I've got a specific question around energy. The papers say that you're going to save 1.3 million, or you're budgeted to make 1.3.
Do you want to save that bit for when we sort of get into the main budget stuff? This is just
I thought you did say you didn't want him to come back, but that's fine. Okay.
The 2.7% split, whereby of the total pot of money, 97.3% is delegated to the Chief Constable and 2.7% stays within the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner. That was a figure I inherited from my predecessor. So that's not something I've invented, it's something I've inherited. What we do every year is that's a starting point. So, of course, my Chief Executive is going to speak in due course about the work of the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner and the various services we either provide or commission. But also within that envelope, we also pay attention to what the Chief Constable is saying. I think this year, how much are we transferring over for the Crime Prevention Directorate to you? £400,000. So that's a one-off payment for this year to help out with that specific area of work. So this is it's a new directorate, is it not? So this is about setting that up and getting it running and so on. So the 2.7% is the starting point. It is not the end of the story. We do not keep money within the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner when we don't need to. We do not refuse funding to the Chief Constable if he absolutely needs it for a good project. But it's a starting point. And I think what would be wrong is to change that basic formula on the basis of 1 year's figures, because this is something that's been going for a number of years. It's worked well up until now. Like I say, we always tweak it a bit every year. I think going forwards, it's the correct thing to do, but it is a flexible amount. It's not something that's absolutely cast in stone and it never changes.
No, I think if we, was it specifically about what the Chief Constable said? Okay, we'll take those and then we'll move on so we can get through a bit more of the detail. We'll go to Kevin first and I'll come to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's again, I think it's important to remember the Chief Constable's point of view, and perhaps you can clarify the fact that the different types of crimes that now are coming onto the scene, which in the past was virtually non-existent. Modern day slavery, for example, and other things, and domestic violence is on the increase and so on, which is adding to the problems that you've got. And of course, the favourite thing that I've always maintained is about neighbourhood policing, how important that is. I don't know whether you've been listening to the radio just at lunchtime, Times Radio. They've got a big debate going on at the moment with regards to police funding and police activities. And there's different people coming on and sharing their experiences, which are quite horrific when you think of one particular area where they used to have 10 officers on neighbourhood policing and now got 2. So the impact of that, of course, is the crime's gone up. Is there any way that we can't kind of maintain that, or perhaps under very difficult tall order, where we can maintain it, or in fact improve on it at some point? And I kind of come back to a question for you.
Yeah, Kevin, it's a really, really good reminder for us just to think about go back to the austerity one. Okay, that was the start. What shifted? So often people draw that as a comparator, but of course, what we know since that point is there's been a huge shift in terms of the nature of crime that is getting reported to policing, both with that is hidden crime, which is driven primarily through cyber, high-tech or technology-enabled crime. But of course, we also have seen a huge focus on additional, and absolutely for the right reasons, around safeguarding, and that has brought with it a significant requirement. And that's it was introduced around the 2015 time. That's where we saw both of those sort of coincide with the point where we needed to start to increase resourcing. So I think what I would say by way of a summary today is the volume of demand continues to increase. The complexity linked with that demand increases. The nature of the crime continues to become more sophisticated. The judicial process that we then capture that and take offenders through has become more time consuming, more costly. All of that is a backdrop of pressure based against a police service which is arguably not got sufficient resource and facing further cuts as we start to go into the future. So there is a real pressure pot that we've got to work our way through. But that said, there is going to be a real focus, certainly locally, to ensure that we really, really do continue to do what I think are the basics and do the basics really, really well. So picking up on your point about neighbourhood policing, I am aware of colleagues up and down the country who have gone to neighbourhood policing because it's considered to be an area where you can take perhaps greater risk and redeploy people out of neighbourhoods into, say, response or into safeguarding. Because again, as I sit here, I've got 300 officers working in the safeguarding departments, different departments, whether it be exploitation, rape, modern day slavery. That's 300 officers off an establishment, which is the same establishment we had in 2010, but that's new additional work. So those 300 officers have to come from somewhere because we haven't grown by 300 over the 2010 numbers. So they're absorbed. What we haven't done in Leicestershire actually is carried the pressure points within neighbourhoods. So our neighbourhoods for us, and I absolutely still maintain this view, I think neighbourhood policing is the foundation of good policing in communities, because that is at the heart of understanding what's going on in the community, responding to the community sentiment. And it feels like after the last couple of years we've just had, to try and remove people out of neighbourhoods would be a really, really short-sighted mistake. So Kevin, that's a very long way of saying neighbourhood policing is absolutely at the heart of it. We will try to protect it as best as possible, certainly in terms of officer numbers. So beat officers working in neighbourhoods, you know, my sense is that we're not looking at this point to shift that. What I would say to you is, of course, neighbourhoods are also made up of officers and staff. Now, I can't sit here and say that there won't be a requirement to have to look at the numbers of PCSOs. I think it would be, you know, PCSOs form the same as staff, but we just need to recognise that when we talk about staff answer the phones. They do the forensic investigations. They're doing the digital investigation, the digital interrogation of devices. They're not people that aren't as equally important. So we've got to try to find that equilibrium across, whilst maintaining a very, very good, solid neighbourhood policing foundation. Does that answer you and hopefully give you some reassurance, Kevin? Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's very difficult and challenging, as you've quite rightly say. If I may, very quickly, going back to Adam's point about the aggregating features, which you've highlighted elegantly, with regards to the risk associated with what we're trying to do today, would form the basis of how you mitigate that through the meeting with ministers, etc. And coming back to Chair and your comment with regards to another letter, I know the previous commissioner was doing exactly the same, lobbying ministers, etc. And unfortunately, it's not got anywhere. That's nobody's fault in this room, I hasten to add. Would it, to enhance that, I'm not sure whether it would, because we've got everybody around the table represents a borough or a county or a city, whatever. The chief executives, would you get them on board to boast of that letter that then says, you know, the whole of Leicestershire is up in arms about the fact that we need to maintain what we've got, if not enhance it, because of the new variations of crimes that's been explained by Rob?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that on board and have a discussion with all the chief execs across the areas. Sarah.
Thank you. I think this question is probably for both the chief and the PCC. The 188 staff number is really concerning. With the level you're at now, they're clearly going to be performing core functions. Around the room, we're all focusing now on the best value we can offer our communities in terms of bang for their buck, in terms of what they're spending on council tax. Is there not a real risk there that police officers are going to be dragged into operational police officers that we know are more expensive because the nature of what they do are going to be dragged into staff roles? And how has that been scrutinised by the Office of the
PCC, and how have you supported the chief, because he might not actually be able to do what's best value because of the terms and conditions and the split of his staffing.
So I'll start with that, if I may. The terms of the uplift in police numbers also includes various, as you would imagine, coming from central government, various rules and regulations. One of which is about the number of police officers that we have. And if we fall below what they consider to be the uplift level, then we will lose funding. So we're effectively in the position that if we reduce the number of police officers, let's say we want to save £500,000 by reducing the number of police officers, we won't, because the Home Office will take away the £500,000 from us. So we've got that number of police officers, the Home Office have sort of baked it in, and that's where we are. So even if we wanted to change it, we couldn't, okay? How the staff are moved around and how many staff are in what department and so on is an operational question. So that's over to the chief for that one. But this isn't really something where there's a huge amount of choice. And of course, you know, where they're sitting and where they're going, and I think has been mentioned earlier, there is a concern that we might be losing staff who suddenly will erroneously think that their job is under threat and move to another job, so we lose them, even though their job was never under threat in the first place. So, you know, this is delicate stuff. We do have to be careful what we say. But the operational side of it, I'll leave to the chief.
So it's a really good question, because actually I think there will be, to a certain degree, some people will have heard the term, you know, reverse modernisation. So many years ago, it was a case of how do you deliver the capability through recruiting staff, put them in a position where you skill them up, you retain them, but you pay them slightly less. And it wasn't that they got less than a starting PC, it was the increments as people progressed through their time in service as a PC that it made financial sense to have a staff member. So I do think there will be a degree of that, in all honesty. But what I would give the panel a reassurance is that I will not put police officers with warranted powers doing stuff that is absolutely back office, for two reasons. Firstly, I think it's fundamentally wrong and it goes against what I believe in. And I also think that actually police officers would leave, because the one thing we need to think about is we've gone through a really extraordinary period. We've recruited 843 new officers, and having met nearly every single one of them, they all come with a real vocation and commitment to serving the communities. If I suddenly said to them, well done, you've just gone through 2 years of training, you've joined a job where you want to do policing, and I want you to do that role there that I'm asking you to do that was done by a staff member before, I can guarantee the calibre of people we've recruited, they'd be off in a nanosecond. So my sense is where we look to reverse modernise, it would be that we would look at the function that was being carried out. I think there is a real focus that runs in parallel with removing staff to looking at identifying non-cashable efficiencies. So that productivity, what is it that the staff are doing that might be able to be done in a different way? And I think we've got to calculate trying to find about 300,000 operational hours to absorb that reduction of work. Then there's the distribution of where those operational hours will fall. And then there's a case of, okay, if we are going to absorb some of the work done by staff members in that particular area, we've got to be confident they can either be absorbed within the staff ratios that remain, or the function needs to be integrated within a broader element of work that could be undertaken by a police officer. Because what I can't do is just do a like for like, because it feels firstly morally wrong, and it will just lead to a bigger problem.
Okay, I'll let Sarah come back in and then we'll move on with the presentations, because that might answer some of members' questions.
Thanks, Deborah. Let me come back in. I just want to follow up on this point around police staff and what it's going to mean, because I'm conscious when people hear staff, they do think of functions other than that a PCSO would do. And that, as you say, bedrock of neighbourhood policing isn't just our warranted officers, it is our PCSOs. And certainly my experience would tell me that our warranted officers can get moved around for operational reasons. If something happens, they're the ones that will get pulled into other places. And it's the PCSOs that maintain those links with the community, maintain that visibility in a way that warranted officers often aren't able to do. So what is your sense of what the impact this budget will have on the PCSOs and that visible policing from that side is your bit? And then for the PCC, just want to understand how you've been scrutinising this part of it and the sort of questions, because obviously they are operational decisions and we wouldn't want you to interfere in those, but your role is very much to hold the Chief Constable to account for those operational decisions. And I just want to understand a bit more about how that is working in practice.
Shall I kick us off with the PCSO? I don't disagree, Sarah, at all. The PCSOs do an amazing job, and you know they're. So do I see that this will be almost like the removal of the role of PCSOs? No, I don't. Do I think that there's likely to be some reductions in PCSOs? Yes, because actually I can't sit here and say I've got to take 188 staff out of an organisation and then say, well, I'm going to protect the officers, I'm going to protect them. Oh, and by the way, I want to answer the phone, the 999s and the 101 in time, because the 200 staff that work in the contact centre, actually, I'm going to reduce them, so I'm not going to be able to answer the phone. So there's some fine dials that need to be worked through here. My reassurance to the panel is, look, and you know that I understand neighbourhood policing. I understand the value of the PCSOs. I also understand the requirement for continuity in neighbourhoods. So one of the things that we are doing at pace is to try and remove that necessity to abstract neighbourhood officers. So Sarah, you talked there about obviously they often get abstracted. The reason they're getting abstracted probably higher than perhaps in previous years is because of the work, the experience level. But what we are doing, and of course, the last year, 23, has been a really extraordinary year in terms of level of protests. So if you look at that front line, a lot of our people that were public order trained and have the skills required in order to deal with those protests were often the people that were a little bit more experienced and are now in neighbourhoods. So at pace, we are upskilling, identifying and training people who are in a broader spectrum that we can abstract from. Now, that is fundamentally about protecting the core of neighbourhood officers that will be to try and minimise abstractions. So hopefully you get a sense from me that, look, do I think PCSOs we will need to look at it. There's a bit of work going on at the moment to look at the productivity because there is some variance across the different areas. So we'd want to look at the productivity we want from it and how they factor into the broader picture. But of course, I do need to remind people, and I know I'm talking to an audience here that actually understand it. When we think about staff and you think about police staff, they fall into sort of 4 or 5 bespoke areas. Our entire, albeit for about 10 officers at the moment, of our contact centre is staff by staff. Now, we could change some of the ratio there. Now, if we could change the ratio there, the expectation, if we're going to put officers in there, I want them to deal with things in a slightly different way, i.e. dealing with demand up front. So that's an area that we might want to look at. The other big chunk of areas of staff is our criminal justice units, for example. Well, I don't think anybody here would say, please stop sending people to court. But I do think there is an element that within that there might be some opportunities to shift the workforce mix. So I think we're going to just have to work our way through it, but hopefully you get an assurance that we're not just going to go with a laser point to one area of the business.
I think this is a good point to give a shout out to Leicestershire Academy that is doing all the training of your new officers, which is...
They won't forgive me if I don't mention them.
Well, that's
thank you for that. Thank you. And again, if you look at the staff ratio in there, by the way, this is a shameless plug. We are recognised now as one of the best training academies in the country. So again, we might need to do a bit of trimming, but I don't think there's wholesale removal.
Yeah, really good for our new officers, really training them. Okay, I'll hand back to you, Mr. Matthews, to continue with your next one.
Yes, as far as doing my job of holding the Chief Constable to account and scrutinising how he's doing things, right through the process of the budget setting, I've been asking all these sorts of questions about, you know, what he's going to suffer, what isn't going to suffer, how are things going to be protected. As you will know, Chair, I've taken very seriously my job of getting out into the community, of talking to residents, talking to organisations, be it parish councils, city councillors, district councillors, to find out what is of concern to the public and what they are particularly worried about. And it will come as no surprise to you, Councillor Russell, to know that neighbourhood policing is always right up there at the top. I was at a meeting of Birstall Parish Council only yesterday evening, and I think probably about half of my allotted time was taken up with neighbourhood policing. So not only was it all through during the course of this process was I constantly asking Chief Constable, what about this, what about that, how about something else? But when we got to the final report, I asked for additional reassurances on 5 different topics where I felt that perhaps we hadn't got quite enough detail of how this was going to be handled. Neighbourhood policing was one of those. I'm pleased to say that the Chief Constable then came back after the Corporate Governance Board meeting with additional assurances which have set my mind at rest. So I feel I've been doing my job properly. I have been pressing the Chief Constable all the way through about how things are going to be done, how we're going to protect the areas of service that the public really care about and which are of great concern, and which I'm quite sure your constituents come to you about as well and want to know. So I'm confident I've been pushing as much as I can, but as the Chief Constable has said, there is a bit of a shortfall, and so something's going to give somewhere, and what we're trying to do is make that as little as possible and as small an impact on the public as possible.
Okay, who's speaking next? Claire, over to you.
Thank you. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to take you through the process that we've been through to set the OPCC budget, because as Councillor has already pointed out, it is absolutely right that this panel challenges the percentage that's given to the OPCC, especially when the force have got to make the level of cuts that they have. So this year, the total amount of funding that's come into Leicestershire, although unfair and unfunded, has gone up on last year. So the force have been provided with more funding, although as the Chief Constables rightly pointed out, the increase that they have to be able to provide for policing has outstripped that increase in funding that they've been given. And so the increase in funding has also impacted the 2.7%. So the 2.7% that's come to the OPCC for us to kind of distribute has also increased. We started with a really robust kind of bottom-up budget process, as I know the force have also been through this year in terms of going through every single line that we pay for. The amount that the OPCC has put aside for staffing this year has increased. Most of that is out of our control because it's around the pay awards, the same as the force, and staff doing their level of increments. We have gone up, as you'll see in the papers, by 2 FTE. So there is an additional 2 people in the OPCC's office this year from last. One of those is a bit of an artificial uplift because it's the Director of Commissioning, which we did have in post last year, but it was filled by a police officer. Rightly so, that police officer has gone back to the force, back into a warranted position where exactly where she should be. The other FTE that's come into the OPCC's office is a communications intern on a 1-year contract that has been funded with some funding that we've been able to bring in to do some very specific kind of communications and engagement work. The cost of the office, so that what we pay for kind of, to keep the lights on, the photocopiers running, all that kind of stuff. Again, we've been through line by line. There are areas that have gone up, like photocopiers, because that's what happened to contract. We've managed to offset that by reducing other areas. So there are other areas that we're making savings around printing costs and all sorts of other things. So that's kind of offsets. That's static. What we do then, after we've kind of allocated what staff we need to be able to fulfil the statutory functions of the office, so the statutory roles that we have to have, the holding the Chief Constable to account, the governance that we have to be able to do in terms of the GDPR, risk, health and safety and all of those kind of roles, we're left with a pot of money that we then look to our commissioning. And this year, instead of choosing to increase the amount that we commission out, we are holding that static. So the amount of money that we push out to do work with victims, with vulnerability, with crime prevention and community safety, that's staying static this year. So that kind of then brings us up to a level with a small pot of money that we're then left with at the top. And what we have chosen to do this year with the Police and Crime Commissioner's support is pass as much of that as possible over to the force to help with their budget deficit. So as the Police and Crime Commissioner has already said, we are pushing about £0.4 million in the force's direction to help with the Prevention Directorate. And then there's about another additional 450k, which is going to support the force do their work with MARAC, the Police Offender Manager, Integrated Offender Management, Domestic Homicide Reviews and Safeguarding Boards, so that the force don't have to pay for that out of their budget. So although the 2.7% looks like it's staying static, we're actually providing more over to the force out of our revenue budget this year than we did last year to support them with their deficit.
Just trying to compute why the percentage is still the same then if you're handing more over.
So we're handing more over out of our revenue, but because it's a year-on-year decision-making process. So the 2.7% is staying static. Next year, who knows, with a change of government, the funding may have changed completely. The force may have enough within their 90 whatever percent, my maths is not good enough, in which case that gives us the opportunity to uplift our commissioning, for example. But on a single year's challenge basis, the PCC wanted to keep that 2.7% the same, even if it meant that a chunk of our revenue was handed over to the force for their work.
So it's still got to be less than 2 points, even though you've budgeted that, but you're handing some over to the force. So yeah, it's still got to be less than 2.7.
Yeah, so we budget obviously on 2.7. So on our line, you'll see that it's increased by 2.7%. That doesn't include the transfers that we make over to the force. So built in within that commissioning budget is if we're commissioning a service to the force rather than, so we don't kind of transfer it straight over. So you can see there's 2.7%.
So I'm still not clear what percentage, if you've handed some of your...
Around at 2.2%.
About 2.2. So the OPCC's office is taking 2.2% of the overall budget, and the rest is going to the Chief Constable. Right. So that really should have been in the, because that wasn't clear in the report to me. Sarah.
Yeah, I don't think that's clear in the report at all, actually, and I think it's really unfortunate that it's not, because I think it is the sort of thing we need to be able to scrutinise effectively here. And I'm a little bit confused, I've got to be honest. I've gone through the current budget around I'm just specifically focusing around the OPCC now, and it looks from this report we've got in front of us that you've got more than 28 FTEs at the moment, and that no longer includes the violence reduction unit. I'm getting a nod that that's accurate. Okay. And yet, if I go back to the same set of budget papers from 2018, there were 17 staff. It's not clear whether they were all FTEs, and that included the VRN. So how have we seen quite such an increase? That's in the public 2018 papers with the staffing numbers there. So they're all on, they're the papers that we produced here, they're on the County Council's website. I am bemused as to how we've seen such an increase in staff in a relatively short period of time, whilst the VRN, I think is my understanding, has moved across to the police force.
We don't usually include the VRN because we don't include the grant, because all of their staffing is offset for a grant. So we don't include the grant, so we don't include the costs or the FTEs for that. So I'm not sure about why that was included in 2018. But from looking at our structure, the 17 wouldn't have included the VRN. I need to double check that, but and the VRN still sits within the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, because we obviously get the grant for that, and the staff still sit there. But again, because we don't have the grant, we don't show the grant in the budget, we also don't show the FTEs because it offsets, so it ends up being cost neutral.
But that's still an increase of 9 staff members since 2018 for the OPCC.
I haven't looked at the staff numbers that far back. As you know, I joined last September, so I've based on what the increase is from last year. So I know the figures I'm saying based on the increase of last year is absolutely accurate. If you need me to look back to 2018 in terms of what the staffing structure was then compared to what it is now, I'm going to have to come back to you, Councillor Russell.
Sorry, Chair, if I may continue, is that all right? I do think it is. Given the significant reductions that we're looking at our police force having to make in staffing, including very much frontline staffing and operational staffing that are supporting it, it does look like we've not only seen an increase incrementally over a number of years, an incremental increase in the staffing into the OPCC, whilst at the same time we're seeing a reduction in the force. And given the 5.4 million savings target that's been asked of the police force, you're saying now about there's being money handed over in revenue to the police force. That isn't in the papers in any clarity at all. And what it looks like from the papers, which is obviously what we have to base our questions on because they're the public record, is that the OPCC is increasing in staffing and budget terms in real terms, whilst we are asking our police force to significantly reduce the service that the public are going to unfortunately be receiving against all of our best wishes.
Thank you. Well, 2018 was before my time as well, so I have no idea what the staff was at that point. As Chief Executive said, we're happy to come back to you with the figures from 2018 onwards to sort of provide comparison on that. As regards how the funding is split, as I've said before, the 2.7% has been there since before my time, so it's a standard figure. As the overall budget increases, the amount of money for the force in cash terms increases, the amount of money for the OPCC in cash terms increases as well. As you've heard from the Chief Executive, we make savings as we go through the year. So we monitor the budget each month to see where we are, try and do a projection of where we think that might lead us to the end of the year. So, you know, we adopt a practice of making our savings as we go through the course of the year, so that we always stay within our envelope. That's how we tend to handle things. So I appreciate what the Chief is saying about the number of reductions he's going to be having to make. But this isn't a case of the OPCC is taking money away from the police. That's not what's happening. The Chief Constable continues to get the same percentage terms of the increased cash. So he's getting more cash in the same percentage terms he's always got. We're getting the same percentage terms out of the overall envelope we've always had. It's the way that I think perhaps cost for what the Chief Constable does has increased in a different way. So, for instance, the OPCC doesn't pay for petrol, whereas that's quite a significant expenditure for all the police vehicles and so on. So I think what you're saying isn't quite right. The overall cash terms have increased. The percentage split has stayed the same. And as you've heard from the Chief Executive, we make our savings as we go through the year so that we always stay within the envelope.
Can I just clarify? Thanks, Chair, for giving me the benefit of coming back. There is nothing set out nationally that says that the OPCC needs to have 2.7%. That is within the gift of the OPCC, is that correct? So you could have chosen to look at making reductions in the OPCC within your staffing, recognising the impact that the current budget is having on the force overall.
And we've already said that we have, Chair, we've already mentioned the £400,000 we're putting across to the force this year for the Crime Prevention Directorate. So again, this is something that just goes on as normal business. Isn't something that we suddenly think, oh dear, we've got to do it. It's just normal business, like looking for savings and efficiencies within the OPCC is normal business. Looking at, should we be giving the police force a bit more this year or a bit less this year? That is also part of the just the day-to-day business of how this is done. I think perhaps you're reading too much into the 2.7 and 97.3. After all, the Chief Constable does get 97.3% of the overall budget. So I'm not quite sure. Sorry, I'm trying to get this clear in my mind. Are you suggesting that 2.7 should be reduced and the Chief Constable should go? Okay. So I would remind you of all the services that the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office provides in terms of victim support, crime prevention, diversionary behaviour activities for youngsters who are vulnerable and may be slipping into crime. Those are the services we provide. We don't all sit there spending it all on tea and biscuits. These are important services that help to keep people safe, that provide real reassurance for the victims of crime, and there is nothing worse than being a victim of crime. These are services that absolutely must be done. We've got some statutory services we have to do. We have some services that we decide to allocate extra to. I think Victim First get a higher percentage than is the national minimum. So we're giving an enhanced service to the victims of crime, which I think is the right thing to do. If you're suggesting money going to the victims of crime should be cut, then I think perhaps you should say so, because at the minute I think we've got the balance about right, but we do juggle the figures every year. We do always look at stuff on a case-by-case basis. That is why we're keeping the percentages as they are. Of course, there is an election for PCC coming up, and other candidates may want to say other things. That's where I stand at the moment. That is the budget I'm putting forward for this year.
Can I
Clarity.
Sorry.
I'm just being absolutely
I'm just going to do
clear.
for clarity. You've come back 3 times now, Sarah. So just for clarity, what Kira's just said to me, so I'm clear, is that with the additional money that you've given over to the force, the percentage of the whole budget that the office has kept is 2.2%, and the rest has gone to the force. Because I'm still not 100% clear, because you've told me you've passed 850k from the 2.7% over to the force. So it would have been good to read in the report where that money is, because I can't see it in the report. If someone can explain how that's sat, because the report is saying 2.7% is sitting with the office, and I think I raised last year what efficiencies is the office going to make. So if what you're telling me is that you've only kept 2.2%, you have made efficiencies this year, but you haven't put that in the report.
Well, we always make efficiencies, Chair. As I say, we do just as we go along. It's part of standard day-to-day practice. I think you'll find the 400,000 is sitting in commissioning.
Yes.
Yes, because we've commissioned the Chief Constable to provide a service in much the same way we commission Victim First to provide a service, and various other parts, outside bodies that provide services for victims of domestic abuse or whatever it happens to be. So that bit's sitting in our commissioning budget, albeit that we've commissioned the Chief Constable to do something with it.
That would have been helpful to be clear in the report, I think, for the panel, because there is some confusion. Yeah, I just think it's, because we're asking, should you reduce the percent? I think we've been asking that for the past 2 or 3 years. So the fact that you commissioned it, but it's given it to the Chief Constable, probably needs to be a bit clear in the report.
Yeah, I think we have in the report, in paragraph 76, we have said what we've put across. We haven't put a figure against it, so take that on board.
Did you want to ask a question on this, on Claire's bit? Because obviously we haven't heard from Kira yet. So a lot of your questions may get answered from Kira. So do you want to hang on and we'll just do the presentations and then we'll ask questions?
Sorry. So if I take you through Appendix 1, which is the budget report that got presented to the Corporate Governance Board on the 17th of January, sorry. And as in previous years, if it's okay with you, Chair, I've assumed the report's been read, but go through the key points. Okay, so I'll take you to page 22, which is the executive summary, and to paragraph 5. The provisional settlement was announced on the 14th of December and confirmed a £7.7 million increase in revenue grant funding. It's also confirmed that the precept referendum threshold has been confirmed at £13 for Bandy property. Also in that provisional settlement, it was confirmed that additional £4.2 million increase for police pension employers' contribution, and also a £2.4 million towards the police officer uplift programme. As you've heard already from the Chief Constable, and it's contained in Appendix 2 of this report, Appendix 3 of the report, the Commissioner has been briefed on the operational challenges, including all the risks, and that has been factored in when building the budget. The budget includes a number of growth items, around about £1.6 million to reinvest into the organisation, but I'll go into them in a bit of detail later on in the report. The Commissioner consulted with local residents back in the summer regarding a perception of crime and policing survey, including resident views around funding for police. The survey was conducted online and through focus groups and asked if residents were prepared to pay more towards policing. 58% indicated that funding for Leicestershire Police collected through council tax should be increased. The Chief Constable presented a budget requirement at £248.5 million, and that based on a £13 precept, and would leave a £5.4 million budget gap. Sorry. After considering the operational requirements, the results of the consultation and the current challenges around the budget deficit, the Commissioner is proposing an increase of £13 on a Band E property. So now I'm going to take you over the page to page 3 and 4 and charts 1 and 2. Overall, funding has increased, but what it does show is that precept is increased at a greater rate than core funding, suggesting that the burden of inflation increases are being pushed onto the local taxpayer. Chart 3 shows an increase in the population by approximately 1% per annum. Obviously, correlation between growth in population leads to obviously increases in demand. Moving over the page onto page 25 on chart 4, this shows the funding per population, per head of population over the last 10 years. And you see, as it says, that Leicestershire is 11th lowest in the country. So if we were to raise this to the average funding per population, that would create an additional £8 million. And obviously, as you can see, £5.4 million gap could get additional £8 million. So obviously, any kind of reduction in the funding, including precept, would adversely impact on the funding that's available for policing for the residents of LLR. Paragraph 23 sets out the total available funding compared to 23-24. As you can see, there's a £13.2 million increase based on a precept increase of £13, making a 5.7% overall increase. That's based on a tax base of 344,284 and a collection fund, which is estimated at the moment of 0.25 million. Still waiting for them figures to be confirmed. So I'll take you through onto paragraph 32 and take you through a number of risks that have been identified during this budget setting process. So pay inflation has been included at 2.5%. It has been suggested by the policing minister on one of the calls that we had that we should plan for a 2.5% increase, but obviously anything above this will be met by the Treasury. And again, that takes us back to the risk around what's funded and compared to what we receive. So the police staff job evaluation, we've included £0.2 million for 24-25 with an implementation date of 1st September 2024, going up to £6.3 million over the MTFP period. As reported previously, there are multiple claims across the country in respect of unlawful discriminations linked to police pensions. Again, no reliable estimate is included at this moment. The emergency services network has been delayed further, so we're now expecting implementation September 2030. And no costs have been included in the MTFP. However, airway terminals are becoming beyond to the end of their life, so there is a replacement cost of 340k, including the capital programme. And again, moving towards the digital transformation, the force has developed a digital transformation strategy, moving from premise data storage to the cloud storage. And obviously going into the future, that will mean a more impact on revenue costs and moving from capital to more of a pull on resources and revenue. So I'll take the next section, base budget preparation approach and scrutiny, as being read. However, I just want to take this point to say that I've myself been working very closely with the Chief Finance Officer on the Force side and with the Force Finance team to ensure that we identify and agree the assumptions and methodology, as well as challenge and scrutinise the budget, not just for 2024, but also for the MTFP. Which takes me on to page 28, which is a revenue budget. The revenue budget has been agreed at 243.153 million, of which 97.3 is allocated to the Chief Constable and the 2.7% to the Chief Executive. The budget is based on 2242 full-time equivalent officers, which equates to 2298 headcount. Also included in there is a grant of £6.5 million for the Police Officer Uplift Programme to maintain them numbers. The 7% pay award for 23-24 has been factored in. A 4.3% increase in employees' pension contribution rate, which has been funded from a Home Office grant, has been factored in. And a 2.5% pay increase for 24-25 has also been included. The police staff and PCSA budget is based on 1,402 FTEs. Again, it's based on a 6% vacancy rate. 7% pay award has been included, and a 2.5 for 23-24, and a 2.5% pay increase has been included for 24-25. The regional collaboration budget is at 10 million pounds, 10.8 million pounds. They are going through a review of their target operating model at the moment. And there's a number of increases in non-pay, largely due to inflation, accreditation costs, or change in legislation, which are having an adverse effect on the forces budget. Also included is the £1.6 million for investments. These include additional resources for the core management department to meet the demand whilst the right care, right person is implemented and embedded. Training to meet additional needs as a result of retirements and accreditations. Upgrade of the HR system, and a new head of prevention and partnerships. Going over the page, the capital strategy and treasury management strategy have been included as appendices to this report. The medium-term financial plan outlines a number of assumptions, which you can see in paragraph 56. I won't go through them, Chair, but which takes us to paragraph 57, where the budget requirement was £248.5 million, of which available funding was £243.1 million, resulting in a £5.4 million funding gap. Any savings that have been realised in 24-25 will obviously impact on that budget gap going forward. Efficiency savings, there's been the £5.4 million is a efficiency savings plan being put together by the force and his team in order to make efficiencies based on £1.2 million reduction in non-salary budgets, 0.5 million efficiencies for regional partnerships, and £3.7 million from pay budgets excluding police officers. But again, that detail will come at a later date. Moving on to reserves. So the reserve strategy is due to be reviewed in March 2024. The general reserve is on the lower limit of the recommended range at 2.04%. I have recommended to the Commissioner to increase that to 2.3%, and I will put forward, as part of the reserve strategy review, a number of options will be presented on how we can increase that. A number of projects have previously been agreed from the budget equalisation reserve. With the agreed use of these reserves and the additional £1.5 million from investments, that will reduce the budget equalisation reserve to £6.2 million at the end of the MTFP period. The Commissioner also holds a number of other reserves which are detailed on page 34. Moving on to the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, as you've already heard from our Chief Executive, percentages remain at 2.7%. And this is so the budget has been built on a model which allows the OPCC to fulfil its statutory functions, hold the Chief Constable to account more effectively, deliver on the police and crime plan objectives, commission services to support people of LLR, understand better the views and expectations of the public, and communicate more effectively with stakeholders. The commissioning budget includes £4.7 million, of which £0.4 million will be spent on small grants and £0.4 million transferred for the prevention and partnership strategy. There is also a Ministry of Justice grant of £1.3 million for 2024. This has not been confirmed beyond this date at the moment, but once we receive that information, we'll let you know and factor that in. As already stated by our Chief Executive, the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner has brought in additional funding through income generation. That's £5.4 million for 23-24, £5.6 million for 24-25, and £0.4 million for 25-26. Pages 36, 37 and 38 is a statement of the Chief Constable and statement of of myself. And again, I will draw you back to the original paper on page 12. And the request of the panel. So in their role to scrutinise the actions and decisions of the police and PCC, the Commissioner requests that the panel examines the contents of the report and the appendices, and he would specifically like to ask the panel to support his proposal to increase the 24-25 precept by £13 per annum for policing purposes to £286.2302 for abandoned property. Thank you.
Thanks, Kira. Before I open it up the question, I'm going to labour this point again because I'm not. So in paragraph 69 of Appendix 1, there's a total of 637,000 commissioning to the force. So that's what you were talking about earlier, I presume. So you're commissioning that money over to the force because you're commissioning them. And then in paragraph 76, of Appendix 1, there's another 400,000 for additional work. So that comes to 1,037,000. Whereas earlier you asked me for 400 and 450 was what was commissioned over to the force. So just a bit of clarity over those figures, please.
So, the 637 on paragraph 69 includes the 400,000, and that also includes the things that are highlighted in paragraph 76. What it doesn't include are things like the safeguarding board and the there's another one.
The domestic homicide.
The domestic homicide, because they are not paid over to the force, but they're paid on behalf of the force. So we commission, we send them over to local authorities on behalf of the force.
So if I can just come in, completely appreciate that actually those figures in that report should have come with a lot more clarity than they currently have in. So if can I run down them just so that everybody's really clear? So the 2.7% is what was allocated to the OPCC. We recognise the level of challenge that the force has got to provide the deficit. So we wanted to make sure that we were contributing to the essential service of the force, plus some additional activity they wanted to do. So £400,000 of that is the force's prevention and partnership strategy. So that's new activity that the force are commissioning this year that the Chief Constable knows is really important as part of that new prevention directorate. The other items that are named in paragraph 76. So the integrated offender management, that's around £25,000, I think. The police offender management, the MARAC, they all come to approximately, I think it's about £200,000, isn't it? And then the safeguarding boards, which Kira's just mentioned, is another £200,000, and the domestic homicide review is in the region of £32,000. So when you add all those together, you get to about 870k that's going from the OPCC to the force for them to provide services, or we commission on behalf of the force so they don't have to pay for it. If the panel would like that documenting after this meeting to come separately, we're really happy to do that.
I think it would be helpful because I was looking from the outside in. All we see is the percentages.
Absolutely. So
the Chief Constable say he's struggling.
Absolutely. So as Kira said, in real terms, although the headline is 2.7%, in real terms, the OPCC for core OPCC functions is retaining 2.2.
Okay. If you could document that after the meeting, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Adam.
Sorry, just as an adjunct to that, and in real terms, how does that compare? So is it a real terms freeze of 2.7%? Or in previous years, has it been more or less than a 2.2 of what we've been talking about previously? Is this additional to what has been received in previous years?
No, so last year it was 2.7. Last year for the force, less than this year, but I couldn't tell you the figure. Absolutely, we'll do that for you.
So I suppose what the panel is trying to get their head around
is that the Chief Constable saying he's struggling for his budget. We're saying, should the office of the PCC give up some of their money to give to the force? And what you're telling us that compared to last year, you have given more to the Chief Constable than the office has kept, which I think is a real key thing that's not clear in the report. And I think that's what panel, because we can only look at the headline figures, you know it in depth, don't you? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask, you've talked about reserves and we've talked about 2.7%. So there are two questions I'd like to pose. So the 2.7% hanging on its own, or 2.2%, without a comparator isn't particularly useful. So it would be useful to know what other OPCC percentages are compared to Leicester of comparable forces. That's my first point, if I can. My second point would be that you've also talked about reserves, and the reserves in the context of what we're talking about are much larger than the amounts we're talking about in differential terms. And so, and of course, reserves are on the balance sheet rather than in the I&E. So I'd quite like to know what the gross amount of reserves the OPCC is holding and the gross amount of reserves that the Chief Constable's budget is holding.
So the OPCC, the Police and Crime Commissioner, holds all the reserves. So because he holds the police fund, he has a statutory responsibility to hold all of the reserves as well. So all of the reserves balance sit with the Chief Constable, with the PCC, not with the Chief Constable.
And what's the total of that? Do you know?
Not off the top of my head, but I can send that information out.
Les.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a really curious question. I don't know whether it's Kira, Claire, or the Chief for this one. The chart 4 on page 25, which is the funding per population. I'm just really curious because it says Leicestershire had 11th lowest in the country. And clearly the graph is showing quite a linear growth from 160 up to 211 in the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, where it was a stable position. I guess there's two questions. So to fulfill what you'd like to fulfill as Chief, what would that 211 actually need to look like? So that's question one, as in what's the technical shortfall per head of population? And I guess the second one is, in here, there must also, I know there's got to be extra services that either you're providing or the PCC is providing that's inherently in those numbers somewhere as you're pulling that extra money down. So I'm just curious as to what's behind this graph that's quite linear growth and actually says, you know, there's a lot more money coming in, but actually you're still falling short. So I'm just curious what's behind that. Thank you, Jeff.
Shall I offer a slight explanation? So I think it's a really, really good observation, because on face value, if you look at it in monetary terms, you say, well, actually, people are paying more. But I think what needs to, or probably is absent, is actually what is the necessary expenditure. Because actually what we're seeing is we are paying more for less. So things are costing a lot more than they did previously, and therefore that is what's driving up the cost per head. I think it would be a really interesting exercise to look at it in cost terms, to say, to maintain, so i.e. to be sustainable as we are now, what would the average head cost need to be? And I think the bit that really is stark there is, so whilst there is a trajectory upwards, people are paying more, but probably not paying enough to maintain the rising costs linked with being sustainable. I take you back to the 11th lowest in the country, and I come back to that gap is likely to continue to, so we are rapidly going towards the bottom despite people paying more. So 11th, so if you look, funded per population is 11th lowest in the country, which means there are others that are gaining more money at a quicker rate. So that gap will continue to worsen. And of course, I always often look at this as what's the demand for the population. So it would be a very interesting exercise out of here, not just to look at the rapid growth in population, the demand linked to that population. We know that people are having to do more, but then actually what people are having to pay for that and what the gap is. It's probably not one to try and work our way through now, but I think the point you're making is a good one.
Chair, can I just sort of come back on? So I think what's really interesting there, Chief, is that because this is looking at funding ahead of population. So in theory, that population growth is in there by default. Well, it says by head of population, so in theory, it's in there. So I think if anybody's got the time and the resource, I think what I would find really interesting, and we face that in other areas that you and I operate, Chair, and indeed Sarah, you know, things like the prevent duty is an extra additional responsibility that's got to be factored in. Somebody's got to resource it and pay for it, and I just wonder, as part of this sort of campaign for better funding, and yeah, we know this funding formula, no government in history has ever sorted this out. So, you know, this isn't a current problem. Well, I rephrase that, it is a current problem, but it's a long-standing problem. And I'd just be interested, I think, as part of the argument with the policing minister and government that says, you know, this isn't just about unfunded wage growth. This is actually about unfunded additional demands on the service. So if within that nice linear graph, because that's a great demonstrator, there was an opportunity to sort of overlay, and here we've picked up this, and here we've picked up that, because we can say in the last 2-3 years, fine, Ukraine, Russia, energy crisis, fuel going through the roof, and we know about the last 2 years of pay reviews in local government. I just think there's a really good question and therefore argument and debate that says, nationally, you've put all these additional responsibilities on us because the VRN will fit in here as well somewhere. Even though it's off book, it's still in here somewhere. It'd just be really interesting to say, nationally, you're putting all these extra demands on a physical resource. And even with consecutive maximum increases in the precept call, we're still falling behind the demand that is needed based on all the services we're now having to provide. So I think there's a really good argument in there, if I may, Chair. Thank you.
We've all got extra responsibilities for no funding, haven't we? So I think that's across the board too.
Yeah, I just thought I'd try and be helpful, Chair, because obviously 2018 is before the majority of the people who are in front of us. So I went back to 2022 instead, looking at the papers, which obviously within the Police and Crime Commissioner's current term of office. And the papers from the Budget Committee at that point state that staffing cost £400,000 less than it does currently in the last 2 years. So I'm just would like to have an understanding of what's happened there. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, staffing costs less than, did you say, than last year?
No, it costs £400,000 more than 2 years ago. Staffing costs, as presented to this panel 2 years ago on the OPCC, there aren't it. Just to be really clear on the figures. So in 2022, the papers that were presented to the panel state that staffing costs were 1215, and this time it's 1615. I don't think I'm wrong that that's a 400 grand difference, unless anybody's going to say my maths is out. I'd just like to understand that change.
Yeah, so a large some of that will be obviously the pay increases over the last 2 years. So again, it's that £1,900 that was awarded, then the 7% increase. There'll also be a change in how the staffing structure has been doing as well. We've got a few changes in that structure, which means that some of the posts will be more, some will be less. So that's kind of adjusted. There'll also be some incremental rises as well. So people go up the scales. So there'll be that included as well. But we can bring you back some more detail on the exact breakdown of that.
I think if I may, Chair, there's also the fact that previously the 2 or 3 members of staff were included under a commissioning budget because they were working on a commissioned service.
Yeah.
But now they've been taken out of the commissioning budget and are showing as a staff cost. So
Yes, that's correct.
2 members?
Three members of staff.
3 members of staff.
So they were sitting under commissioning, and now they've moved into the staffing budget to be more.
So they were always there, but they're now showing up on the staffing budget rather than the commissioning budget.
I think with the chair's agreement, I do think it would be useful for the panel to understand the detail, because that all sounds very legitimate, but not quite 400 grand's legitimate. And that's the sort of challenging bit in there. So having that and the transparency around that across a 2-year period, I think would be really helpful. Yeah.
Adam, did you have a?
I might ask my energy question now.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. So in the papers, it talks about £1.3 million saving, energy saving, gas and electric from Crown Commercial Services. It's your current provider. I'm interested in your assessment of the current energy market and the volatility that we know exists, and how reserves play into that, because that is quite a big chunk of a saving for your gas and electric. And also how that features within the capital budget and the installation of air source heat pumps, and how that programme is going, and what the full costs are of that programme, whether you've done the feasibility work, whether you understand the complexities of connecting to the grid, and any additional capital costs there might be to that as well. I'm only asking because I've got some bruises around a schools programme that we've done, and it'd be. I'd just like to forewarn you that if you've not thought that through, you might want to. Thank you, Chair.
So we do buy our energy costs in advance. So we do buy them around about 6 months in advance of. So we do we've based it on the prices that we kind of been told through our experts. We do have an expert in energy efficient tell us what the prices are going to be, and kind of look at what the forecasts are. So we do base it on that fact, and we've factored them assumptions and them estimates into the when we're building the budget. I don't know if you'd be able to answer the one on how you're doing with the.
Yeah, I mean, look, Adam, I do get the complexity of this one, and I'm reassured that certainly Paul Dawkins has brought in a number of experts to look at it. A lot of the replacement programme was due, so it was a case of what do we replace to? Do we start to look to the future? So this wasn't just driven by the green agenda and trying to reduce the carbon footprint. It's been aligned with routine maintenance and repair. So there's definitely that alignment. And of course, within that, you will see an unusual capital spend to do with creating a solar revenue. Now, of course, lots and lots of work has gone into that, and the idea being that our greatest carbon footprint and energy usage is our headquarters. So of course that's why we're trying to use that as an idea to reduce our expenditure by about 50% in that location. So I know there's a lot of work going on, but he repeatedly we recognise the fact that there's some risk, hence why we're probably likely to start to have conversations about delaying some of the move for electrification of vehicles, because again the volatility and speed by which that's changing. So there's lots and lots of due diligence that's going on around it.
As there is at Leicester City Council.
Yeah, I expect that.
I'm interested to know what the kind of the programme is, and kind of how it, because you will make savings if you get an air source P pump working potentially, and you get your solar farm working. So how does that factor into your electricity costs that are budgeted for? Are we going to complete this year? What is the programme?
Well, certainly if I pick up what I'm being briefed on, the programme is in. I've seen it. I've seen the timeline in terms of what the works are being allocated. The contractors are there and they're working their way through it, and we'll get a bit of an update in terms of the progress. So as it stands, as I sit here, there is a programme of heat replacement across a number of locations across the force, and I know that the investment around the solar was scheduled during 24-25 as the capital, and that's about as far as I can give you here. I think it would be reasonable to go and ask the Commissioner to ask for a paper from me on that, because it's routine. It's a programme of work that we're delivering, and part of our overall governance. We routinely will be reporting into the Corporate Governance Board on progress against key strategic programmes of work.
Just a comment, £1.3 million is quite a lot of staff, if that's a saving you're making. So I know you're saying it's routine, but I know you need to make savings, but there's a conversation to be had with what you do with that saving.
No, I agree. I don't disagree with that.
And I think in previous panel meetings, we have brought back reports on how the capital programme is being delivered. So I think that was something we could bring back as part of that.
Sarah.
Sorry, this comes back to commissioning, I'm afraid. There was, I've just totted up the figures that are mentioned in the papers that we can see, and there seems to be quite an unaccounted amount in the commissioning spend within the Office of the OPCC. So I'm just wondering, when the report comes back to us, can we have details of how that intends to be spent, and if there's any scope within that that can go towards supporting the force? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll do that for us. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Can I come back to the 2 points I raised earlier? Because on the first point, which was comparable costs of the OPCC, I don't think I got a response. And I think I'm not normally a member of the panel, but I would have thought the panel would be really interested in understanding how the cost of the Leicestershire OPCC compares to other comparable forces, because that gives you a guide as to the discussion we had previously. You may not have the information now.
No, I don't have that information to hand at the moment, but it is something that I've written down as we definitely need to bring back.
Thank you.
And I can just say as well, with different OPCCs, they all have different kind of setups as well. So some own kind of the estate function, some don't. So again, so what I'll do is we'll bring that back and also explain that as well, because like I say, different OPCs, some have got fire, some haven't. So the cost will differ from PCC's office to PCC's office, but that's something we can.
Okay, I don't think it would be a useful guide for the panel. Can I just make the second point, which was
just
again
say that I don't think going by percentages is particularly helpful, as we found out today. So I think it is quite complex, but it'd be interesting to get that back. Did you want to
I was talking sterling.
Yeah, Chair, I think you've nailed it. There are such variants across the country, and of course the starting point is, well, what's the total expenditure and the cost and the budget envelope they start with. So I think it's a useful insight, but I wouldn't put too much weight on it.
Yeah, my second point again is about reserves. So you've confirmed that you hold all the reserves, but I'm quite interested in the total, in the gross amount, and some of the statements in the reserve strategy that you've got. So it looks to me like you're holding something close to 27 million.
Yeah, around about 26.
Yeah, 26.8. I
Yeah.
calculated approximately. The two I've got questions on is that you say you're increasing the general reserve, which must be around about 5.1 million, I think, and you're saying you're going to increase that to 2.3% in the next year. And the other point is the OPCC reserve. You're saying there's no proposed use of this reserve in 24-25. Well, the nub of my question then is, I understand you've got a reserve strategy, and I understand that's been approved, but in the light of the Chief Constable saying that he's going to have to effectively remove 188 full-time posts, isn't there a playoff here where because making people redundant and then re-recruiting the same skills but probably at a lower level is a really expensive way of operating? So isn't it better to preserve police officers now rather than earmark reserves that could be used?
We are currently reviewing the reserve strategy, but one of the things that the Commission has been very clear on is that the reserve need to have a specific purpose and an end date. So we can't use it just to kind of bridge gaps, because there needs to be an exit strategy and a way to become more sustainable. And paying for things like staff roles through a reserve in the long term is not sustainable. So it's a short term fix, but in the long term it's not a sustainable. So the Commissioner has been very kind of vocal, but that we won't use any of our reserves for short term. It has to have an exit strategy. It can't be for something that's a long term, it's not sustainable. So, but we will review that as part of the reserve strategy.
only spend your reserves once. We all know that, Rob.
Yeah, it's really just to support that. I mean, obviously, it's going to be tricky. We're going to work it through. I sense there will be conversations about the reserves, but we absolutely support the fact that it won't be about sustaining and keeping people indefinitely, but invariably balancing out the making people redundant and paying the redundancy costs versus retaining them for a few months and then trying to fast track some of our skilled staff, because I think we've got some really skilled staff that would make really good police officers. So we might do a fast track of, if they're an investigative support officer that we've spent huge amounts of money on, One of the things that was touched on, we're going to review the East Midlands Special Operations Unit. There is some highly skilled people in that environment. Why wouldn't I like to try and retain them and fast track them into a different route into the organisation? Now, there is a very, very sensible conversation to be had then about the issue of reserves versus skills retention and a clear timeline. So I think, you know, I totally understand where we are in terms of the reserves strategy. But I think, you know, as we work it through, there might be some things that we want to come back and revisit.
Are there any other questions from anyone? Otherwise, I'll stop my long list. Kevin.
Well, it's not that long. All right. It's just a clarification really about the pension grants. On page 13 in the table 11, it refers to the fact that there's 6.6 things excluded from the budget is a 6.6 Home Office pension grant. Is that right? Then you go to page 14. And then it talks about police pension contributions increase of 4 million, which is funded by the Home Office grant. They just need, there's a 2.2 difference in that.
Yeah, so last year we got a grant for pensions of £1.9 million, and then we've had additional funding for it. So this year, so the 1.9 we had wasn't just for last year; it was for previous financial years. But we had an additional 4 million on top of the 1.9 for the increase in the contribution rate that came into play for 24-25.
Still doesn't make the 2.2, does it? Is it?
I don't know
where's that shortfall picked up on it? Is if you've only got a grant for 4 million,
got the grant for 4 points. Let's see.
That's it. Maybe in there somewhere. I can't find it. Well, get the figures to add up. And whilst you're looking at that, I think the question for me, of course, is that this is before your time. Back in 1920. The increase in council tax was £24 per household. That was made up of £12 to deliver 107 police officers, but another £12 was the cost of a pension shortfall of £500,000. Now, I can't find anywhere back papers, which it's before your time, but perhaps you can investigate it. Was that £12 as a one-off to cover that 500 million, or are we still continuing to pay that £12 on the precept?
So the pension in 1920, so I have gone in and looked at what was said. So we got a grant in 1920 for...
Sorry, Chair, can I just interrupt? You mean 2019?
2019, yeah. Sorry.
Not 1920.
Not before I was born.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's before your time, so it's not... But the interesting thing for me, because I was there, is the reason it went up to the local taxpayer by £12 to cover that deficit in the pension. That's what's worried me about this 2.2. Is that gone on to the precept and we are now paying that locally as we've done with this one? And is the £12 was a one-off to get rid of that deficit, or are we still continuing to pay that £12 identified as a pension?
Yeah, so in 2019-20 we received a grant for pensions, but there was a shortfall in it. The Home Office didn't give us the full amount. So what happened was that there was about £500,000 was attributed from the precept to pay for the pension. That was for the previous increase. So that was the increase in 2019-20. So any kind of increase that happened then continues to fund that part of that, because we haven't had that increase still. So it's the new grant that we've got is only for the increase that we've got for 24-25, and it isn't backdated. It doesn't cover the previous increase, so that will still have to be funded through the force for that gap in the pension. So
there's a continuation of the £12 anyway that people are paying for to support the pension pot, which they deserve, I seem to add. And the last one, if I may, Chairman, we go about commissioning. I've said this before, time and time again. No matter where you go, what authority it is, whatever turns up, there's a commissioning group in every single one. Very expensive commissioning groups. What I've said is, why don't you get together and have one commissioning group? Somebody said, oh, well, the skills are different. They're not. they're not different at all. I've been in there, done that, and done the job, so they're not different. It is so there's a saving there. Once you start looking at it seriously, there could be some saving in joining the commissioning groups together in one.
Yeah, and going back, grant of 6.5 million, 1.9 million pound of that was for the previous. Which we just spoke about the shortfall, and then the rest there was for the pension grant. There's also some pension administration costs included in that as well. If you go to appendices, appendix 1, I'm just trying to find the page. There's a line that says Home Office Pensions Remedy one-off grant, and some funding there for that as well.
Okay, that's one off my list, so thank you. My first one is about the right care, right person. So I know ACC Streets is leading on that for the 4. So I'm just wondering how long it will take to embed and how many hours of resources is that likely to free up?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, can I just put on record, thank you, because I think the partnership, I know there was a bit of anxiety around this to start with. He says, Les, this is me being diplomatic, by the way. I think there's a little bit of anxiety and a few letters flying around. I hope at that point people got the reassurance this is a necessary thing to do because of obviously the backdrop of what we face. But I just want to put on record, thank you to the partners who have really got around the table. They're really working well together. Where do I think we are? They're working through a really structured approach to it, starting with the obvious overlap with mental health, as you would expect. As I sort of sit here today, they're currently they've already removed equivalent to 600 incidents a year that were coming in that police were having to respond to. That's circa effectively 2 full-time staff. That's 80 hours. That's 4,160 efficiency savings, if you like. So to go back to that, we're going to have to find 300,000 hours of productivity gains. That's 4,000 straight away. I'm told that they are working at pace against they're looking at 10 areas at the moment, which is around 10 incidents a day, 8 of which are the current response for welfare, and 2 that relate to missing from home and doing things slightly different. If that is delivered, that will lead to a further efficiency of 12,480 operational hours. So again, all of these things are all small bits towards that big pot. So as we start to reduce staff in some areas, if we can start to free up operational capability elsewhere in doing these sorts of things, it will start to close the gap. So this is one of many bits that we will need to do in order to strive to get that 300,000 hours worth of productivity gain to be able to absorb workload. Because I'm really, really concerned. You take staff out without taking the work out or doing it differently, we break the staff. So that's the approach. But formally, if I can put on record my thanks, that would be grateful.
And do you know where you are against other forces in sort of embedding this?
Well, again, it's a bit like the comparator. There will be those forces. So everybody talks about Humberside as being the sort of panacea. I think they started from a totally different position to us, if I'm honest. I think we've been doing most appropriate agency for some time. We had triage cars, we had all sorts of things which they never had. So, whilst, and it's very easy to take somebody who had a almost non-existent service, radically get loads and loads of gains out of it. Well, we've been incrementally working on this for some time. So I think an obvious comparator is going to be difficult. What I'm looking for is, okay, a real clear, almost forensic understanding of the demand and what the need is, and then start to work through. But what I'm encouraged by is that we are identifying efficiencies, we are working well together, and that will contribute to productivity gains. And for me, I'm not getting drawn into the where are we against Humberside. I'm trying to do the right thing by the people of Leicestershire and Rutland.
Thank you. My second point is on page 19 at that paragraph 52. So obviously there's opportunities for grant funding all through the year. So it says there that secured 6 million already for the next 2 financial years to be spent on services to residents of LRR. Do we know what that's been spent for? What that money was for?
The extra grant funding we've got coming in, do you say? So that's for things like the DA perpetrator programme, Safer Streets, things like the Violence Reduction Network, a number of Ministry of Justice grants that we've got for DA and the sexual violence schemes as well.
Yeah,
Just say, because just sort of getting 6 million for next week doesn't tell us anything really. So some detail around what that's actually going to deliver.
Yeah, I think probably some detail around the whole commissioning framework.
Yeah, would be useful. Yeah. Okay. My next question, just to take back to DCC Sandal as well, his report was really, really useful to understand. So if you can take that back and pass on the panel's thanks for him to understand how the force is operating was really useful. And I suppose going on from that and efficiencies, what we've been talking about is the future for AI efficiencies. So where's the force in that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so again, you'll remember one of the complex issues that we had to work through is about our IT and how we were going to bring in this new technology, and it is a strand of work within Op Forefront. So obviously, people talk about Forefront around service standards, connected leadership. There is a real strand that's running all the way through there about bringing in new technical capabilities. We've completed the IT review. We are now bringing in new resource, new skills into our IT department. We have now got a multi-cloud strategy. We are already starting to switch on automation and the use of bots and how we can do it. And now what we're starting to do, and it will feature very heavily in this next phase. Now we've got the foundations in place and the technology in order to allow us to do it. Now what we need to do is identify those areas where we think we can either automate without obviously providing a poor service, and where we might use AI in a better way. So I'm pleased to report good progress. It's now how we optimize that in order to take out the efficiencies.
And I will pick up the overtime. I know you touched on it earlier. So is that full 4 million of overtime? You also said it's spontaneous, where you're dragging people off and extending their hours. So are they paid additional on top of their normal wage for that overtime then? So rather than the standard man hours, are they paid additional for that?
It can vary depending. I mean, obviously an overtime will attract a slight increase, but what it does do is it creates operational flexibility. So within that pot, straight away take 25% out, because that's about just maintaining minimum cover on bank holidays. And what we are also starting to see now, and you know, it's a very distasteful approach, but people that are protesting and that are trying to make a point are targeting bank holidays, because they know that staffing levels are low. So invariably, whatever you budget for, that can very quickly change, because you can be faced with quite a dynamic sort of evolving picture. So, but if you think 25% will be on bank holidays, there is an increasing trend that we are needing to often respond to incidents that are planned for those days. But also it then breaks down to planned and spontaneous, as I sort of touched on earlier. I know there's always a debate about, do you take that pot of money, reduce it down, and then use some of the money in order to employ staff? The challenge you've got is, firstly, can you employ the staff with the right skills that you need when you're using that operational flexibility? So there will be a requirement, often both planned and spontaneous, that I will need to run within the force. My team will respond to high-end, high-risk CBRN firearms type incidents. Firearms deployment, pretty routine nearly every day. Depending on what that is, that might require us to extend. I can't recruit more officers, because invariably, for the level that you would get in terms of the uplift for the officers for that skill, it's then aligning the skill you need for when they're on with a shift pattern. So there's lots of science behind this. What it does do is it does give you real operational surge, and that's where the vast majority of the expenditure is. And where it's not in that operational space, whether it be planned or spontaneous, of course, it's generally looking at filling gaps that we have got whilst we're either recruiting in or other things. So we constantly look at the overtime. What I would say by way of reassurance, we have brought in a lovely piece of software now where the visibility of spend is absolutely in real time. So on a regular monthly basis, we are looking through what's the spend, what's the output from that spend, and is there a way to trim it? Overlay that in the context of a 5.4 million gap. What I would say is, earlier I was talking about 188 staff, potentially worst case scenario. The more that we can compress down the non-salary costs, so overtime being one of them, the more that we can make efficiency gains and savings in that space, the less we have to make around the 188. So 188 is not a fixed number, but actually it's worst case scenario.
That's useful, thank you. And
not my final question, second from last question. It's about the regional stuff and the regional budgets. I know they got a really bad inspection report, didn't they? And I did ask for something to come to here, but we haven't had it yet. And I suppose it's probably a question for both of you and are we getting value for money? Are we getting what we need from that, from what we're paying in? Because you tend to, when you have a regional collaboration, one force will be spending more than the other. So do you think we're getting value for money? Are we in the right place? Are we happy with the inspection and the improvements that they're making?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what we've had in year is a cash reduction, which is different to inefficiency, because the expenditure required to maintain the current level of service within our regional collaboration. So primarily we're talking about East Midlands Special Operation Unit, but we've got some small collaborations that bolted onto that. The cost increase, the cash envelope required to maintain what we've got, was coming in at about 44.5 million. We've trimmed that to 42 million in year. But how that then transfers into cashable, because some of that is about officer numbers. So obviously we're maintaining officer numbers, we're just redistributing them. To give you some assurance, and not that I'm not busy enough, it's been agreed with the 5 chiefs going into 24-25 that I'm going to be the SRO for the transformation programme, looking at the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, with a view of that I suspect we will look at how we reduce down whilst maintaining some fairly critical capability. So do I think we will get value for money? Absolutely. Hence why I've just added it to the workload, but I hope that gives you some reassurance.
You're not claiming overtime for it, are you? Anything you want to add, Mr. Matthews?
I think Chief Constable's dealt with it. Thank you.
And my final question is about the capital spend. So there's 6.5 million of external borrowing required for 24-25. So I suppose the revenue costs of paying that back, especially in the current climate with interest rates higher than they have been. Is this the right time to be borrowing? Is there any other way we can do it than external funding? And what are we using that borrowing for?
So the borrowing would be used to fund the capital programme for all a number of projects that have been identified in that programme. We don't take borrowing lightly, so we will obviously look at all our options, especially things like trying to borrow internally rather than trying to go out external and be hit with high interest rates. So we do obviously take that into consideration. We didn't actually borrow anything in this, not borrowed anything for this financial from 22, 23 to 23, 24. So, but again, we do kind of look into that and make sure that we look for the best rate possible and borrow at the right time if we need to. Based on the revenue side, we have factored in interest charges of around just under £1 million for repayment, and we have to set aside a prudent kind of provision called minimum revenue provision, and that's £5.2 million. Our outstanding debt that we've got is only 14.6 million at the moment. Obviously we'll keep an eye on that and make sure that we don't go above our limits, and that we are kind of looking for the best value that we can. But again, it's kind of something that we don't do lightly. We always make sure that it's affordable and look at the affordability of it before we go into any decisions.
Mr. Matthew, are you looking at what this capital expenditure is for, and is it definitely needed? Because I think the worst thing to do is pay £1 million in interest payments when we're talking about, having to slim down the force. So I think the question we're all asking ourselves, especially within our local authorities, is do we need this capital programme? Do we need to borrow and pay that interest charges back? So what's the view of that at the moment?
Okay. When we look at all the capital projects, we sort of grade them between essential, would be nice, might be not, and also where you can save money, because if you, stitching time saves 9. So if you do the maintenance earlier, you actually save money in the long run. So we have gone through all of that. And what you've got in front of you is sort of the end process of that. We didn't include all the workings out, if you like, but I can assure you the Chief Constable and I have ploughed through all of this at some length, and what we end up with is what is absolutely essential, rather than that it would be nice to have, which I agree with you. Borrowing money to do something that would be nice to have at this particular time probably isn't the best use of borrowing requirement.
Chair, could I be bold and just sort of come in on that and just give, again, reassurance that these will constantly be reviewed? I think, we talk about this special case. I wouldn't mind coming back and just revisiting some things and just sort of leave you with some thoughts to think through. And I know that this will be picked up with the conversation with the Police and Crime Commissioner, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that forces used to receive a capital grant. And the removal of that capital grant has meant that all forces are borrowing against, and what they're borrowing for, they're borrowing not just about maintaining estate, they're borrowing to buy cars to put on the road, they're borrowing to, have a control room which is fit for purpose, and these are things that previously were provided through a capital grant. So again, when we start to build up this picture, the £1 million cost, absolutely right. Do we want to pay £1 million in interest? No, that was £1 million we didn't used to have to pay.
Thank you for that.
Just to follow on from that, I'm conscious of Les's questions earlier around the head per funding per population. When we get, because you asked for some details to come back around that, it'd be really helpful if we got something that took into account how money's been changed over time, because actually having to do a capital outlay that you're then having to pay revenue on the borrowing against doesn't feel like a sensible process, and it's really hard sometimes to see the true changes in funding over time when things like that are fairly opaque to most of us. So that if we could include that in when you come to follow up on Les's bit, that would be really helpful. Go ahead.
This is on. I read somewhere in a report, the 2022 until the March, our force is leading force on nationally, I mean, the Leicestershire Police was a leading force. What happened in the last 10 years, last decade, we are in a leading position on the nationally. What was happened in the last 2 years? Not even 2 years, less than 2 years. So we are shifted significantly this position.
Yeah, I'm going to
read somewhere in
so I guess I'm wondering so I still think we are regarded as one of the leading forces in the country, and I think reputationally we would have people would see us as a fairly progressive force, both recognised by peers and HMI. I think that hasn't shifted. I think what has shifted is it goes back to the complexity and the demand and the challenges that we're experiencing. And so in the context of policing, that's probably where I would say we are. What I also think is you've got to look at policing is often responding to external factors. And what we are seeing is there has been some fairly significant shifts externally across predominantly within the city around some of the community dynamics have been influenced by international to local. That has led to some tensions. So I would say that there is an additional layer of complexity around community makeup, intergenerational differences. I think politics has taken a different tone in certain areas, and the alignment between communities with different political views. All of that, from a policing perspective, creates quite a lot of challenge. And of course, the other thing that we're responding to is some of those global events. So if we think about 2023, it's been an unbelievably challenging operational year. But at the heart of that global to local narrative, which often gets missed, gets played out in Leicestershire. So whether it be protests in support or whatever, we have had a massive demand over this last year. So I don't know if I've actually answered your question, but I think what you're saying is, are we in a deteriorating position? We're in a deteriorating position in terms of funding, but certainly not in ambition or commitment.
I think we are on top position until March 2022. And we are without a reserve we're using, we are on top. Using our reserve, as Councillor Johnson mentioning, we are not using our reserve on that time, but now we are shifted, so that was my question. Thank you.
Okay, are there any final questions before we move to the recommendations? So thank you, panel, for all your questions. I think we've got a really good scrutinise of the budget. So I'll take you back to page 12. So the PCC has brought the report to outline the police and crime panel how he's fulfilling his duty when setting the budget for 2024, and put forward a policing
precept for consideration by the panel. So he's asking the panel to support his proposal to increase the 2024-2025 precept by £13 per annum, which relates to 286.23 for a Band D property. Can members please clearly if they're happy to support that recommendation?
I would just, I'm comfortable with us agreeing the increase in the precept. I'm conscious though that the panel has asked for significant additional details today that weren't available in the papers, and I think it would be understandable if, whilst we obviously our role here is to approve the precept, that doesn't mean an endorsement of the budget without understanding those details that sit behind it. So I think as long as there can be absolute clarity that the increase in the precept is recognised as necessary to do whatever we can to maintain figures across the force, but the broader budget, it would be the panel needs to see a greater level of detail and confirmation before we could feel comfortable with that going forward.
Okay.
That's a question as well.
That's been promised to come back to us. Kevin?
Yeah, we were here last time, last year when we set the budget, because most of the recommendations are to note report. So you said we've got to approve it, and the commissioner said we've got to approve it. We don't approve it, what we do is note it. And I note it, and hopefully that you know, it goes through, but I can only note it, I can't approve it.
It's to support the proposal is what I said. So all those in favour, please show. Is there anybody against? Okay, thank you very much, panel. Thank you for everyone for all the information. We'll move on to item 6 now, which is section 106 update, which is just a verbal update. Kira, are you taking this?
Yeah, I'll take this. Thank you, Chair. It's not a lot to update on today. Just to say that we have a new Section 106 officer who has started in force. He has got experience in Section 106 from a local authority perspective. So yeah, great to have him on board and be able to kind of push forward with the work around Section 106 and getting some of them funding back in. Just say we've had a little bit of kind of push back on some kind of drawing down some funds. So we'll kind of be reaching out to if you have agreement with this panel to some of the panel members for some support with that. We are still continuing to progress some of our projects and trying to draw the funds down for that. So but there is, like I say, a few pushbacks and also a few pushbacks around repurposing as well. So I'd really support some help with that. That'd be, thank you.
Absolutely. I'm sure Les has got his hand over. I'm probably going to say exactly what he's going to say. Yeah, whatever council it is, just reach out and copy me in as well, because we're really keen to get this out. So I'm sure every member will be happy to push their local authority to change their minds about what they're pushing back on. So really key we get this over the line. Did you want to add?
So I think I'm hoping the local authority I represent, which is basically where your headquarters is, you've actually found them quite supportive, and I do understand that as they move into the future and those future 106 agreements, they are absolutely looking to make the wording more flexible, because it has to be in the modern world. Thank you, Chair.
We're not going to out any districts here, but the contact will be made. Okay, can we make sure this is state, Kevin?
Right, I support what you said. The new officer, is that come under you, Rob, that the new 106 officer? Is it possible then to have the name of that particular person? Because I think we need to meet with him. We've met with the previous officer because we, from a planning point of view, we want to make sure that we've done it with our planning officers. When new estates come up, we can start talking about the type of lamppost. I know it's maybe insignificant to you, but we want lampposts installed which can carry cameras, absolutely, be flexible.
Yeah.
We worked with the previous one, so let's try and work with the other one to get that in place as well.
I mean, Chair, I'm very happy to put on record. You know, it's great that we've got the person in ahead of where we're going with the because I've put an immediate recruitment freeze on, as you could imagine. So that person is in. So we need to optimise it. But just to give you some reassurance, in my diary, I've seen it, a conversation around 106, because it naturally links to where we're going, the capital, etc. So again, be reassured. But I'll gladly put it on record that I expect people to work together on it collaboratively, and just again echo the support from previously about going and having a look at this. And I know, you know, certainly, Chair, you were heavily involved in it, but I think it's time now. We just need to push on with it.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, and we'll keep that on the agenda going forward, even if it's just a verbal update. I forgot to mention right at the beginning that Rani was missed off attending on the minutes. So are we happy that she's added on the minutes because she was here at the last meeting? Thank you. Okay, the date of next meeting takes place on Tuesday, the 12th of March. 2 p.m. There's no urgent items, and I just want to put on record thank you to the panel for all their questions. I know it's been quite a long meeting, but thank you very much for all that, and thank you for everyone that came to present to us today. So thank you very much.